public lecture by the Nova Scotia Institute of Science. Today's talk is co-sponsored by Wise Atlantic, which is an organization that aims to break gender stereotypes in science to girls in junior high and high school, and also provides professional development opportunities for early career female scientists and engineers. Today, we will be hearing from Dr. Glenys Gibson. She's a professor of biology at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. Glenys did her PhD at the University of Alberta. She did her postdoc at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and she's been a faculty member at Acadia University since 1995. Glenys studies the evolution and development of marine invertebrates, benthic ecology of marine invertebrates, and she teaches developmental biology and histology. Glenys, welcome to the Nova Scotia Institute of Science. We're really looking forward to your talk on the life and times of marine invertebrates in the Minas Basin, and which you're going to tell us about polychaetes, plasticity, and microplastics. I want to remind everyone to become members of our society if you're not members already. We'd love to have you and see you at our future meetings. So Glenys, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. And Glenys has an exciting talk planned for us with some interactivity.
Thanks, Tamara, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you tonight about some of the work we've been doing in the Minas Basin out of Acadia University. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. It's the proverbial dark and blustery evening out there. Feels like fall is really starting to turn, so I appreciate your carving some time to come out and learn a little bit about the invertebrates of the Minas Basin.
Sound hasn't started yet.
If everyone can just turn off their microphones, that would be great.
Okay, so a little bit about the Minas Basin. I am here out in Wolfville. The Minas Basin is a globally unique ecosystem, but because it's right in our backyard, we often take it for granted. It's really an extremely unusual place. Most coastal ecosystems have fairly clean water. Primary productivity comes from phytoplankton or single-celled algae in the water, and a fair bit of stability in the substrate. The Minas Basin doesn't have any of that. There has a huge amount of suspended sediment, which means that there's a lot of ongoing erosion of the sediment and deposition of the sediment. Because there's so much sediment in the water, there's no phytoplankton, and primary productivity comes from bacterial films or from the salt marsh detritus. So here's a little bit of salt marsh here. And of course, we've lost most of our salt marsh in the last 400 years. So it would be interesting to go back 400 years and see what the basin was like when it had that really rich source of primary productivity to feed its inhabitants. So how much sediment is in the water column? This is a good question, and smarter people than I have addressed that. So there's some statistics and references down at the bottom. In the surface water in the summer, about 10 grams of sediment per cubic meter. And in the winter, this can go up considerably to 80 grams per cubic meter. And surface sediment, so at the surface sediment in that interface layer between the deposited sediments and the water, 200 to 300 grams per cubic meter. And if you're having a hard time visualizing that, it's a lot. Just visualize a lot of sediment in the water. And it really creates a very unique and in many ways very extreme environment for the small animals that live there, because out in other coastal areas, the typical food they would have isn't available. And also the substrate just keeps moving and changing all of the time. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing on biodiversity in the Minas Basin. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the adaptations some organisms have to survive in this very dynamic, rapidly changing environment. And then finally, a little bit about some of the work we've been doing recently on microplastics. So biodiversity in the Minas Basin. You're saying, I've been to the Minas Basin. There's a whole lot of nothing. As a matter of fact, there's just like a whole lot of sediment. And you can go a long way before you actually see any signs that you might recognize as a form of life. It turns out there is a lot of biodiversity, but your first impression when you walk out is just a sea of mud, very extensive tidal flats that are sort of a mix of mud and sand. For us to get to some of our low intertidal sites, it's a 2-kilometer walk straight out across the tidal flat. So these flats can be very extensive. And your first impression is there's really not a lot of life in that sediment. But it turns out there is a lot in the sediment, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. In the Minas Basin, there's maybe 450 species of invertebrates, so a lower diversity than you would expect in a cleaner, maybe a rockier coastal environment, but a lot more than you'd think. And we're not really sure about this number, 450. There's some species that get seen every few decades, and a lot of people don't pay that much attention to them. There's some species that probably need to be put back together. But there's quite a number of species that are out there. Most of them are small. They burrow in the sediment, so they're very easy to miss unless you look for them. They can be very patchy. Our impression is that a lot of them are very short-lived, but some of the clams can be 60 to 80 years old, so they're not all short-lived. And a lot of them are very opportunistic. So as soon as there's an area that gets disturbed, some of these species, particularly the polychaetes, can just get right in there and establish new populations and communities in that disturbed habitat. The majority of invertebrates out there are polychaetes, and there's one over here. This is Chaetozoni. They're very, very abundant out there. And polychaetes are tiny marine worms. There's several phyla of worms, but polychaetes are segmented worms, so they're in the phylum Annelida. And they show quite an impressive range of functional as well as taxonomic diversity. So taxonomic diversity, that would be the species name. Functional diversity would be more about ecosystem contributions. So where they live, what they eat, what sort of feeding appendages they have, and those sorts of things. So we'll just look at a couple of examples of species that you might not really expect to find out in the Minas Basin because they're very localized and very patchy. This is an example of sandcastle worms. They're Sabellariidae. And here's what the actual worm looks like when you take it out of their tubes. Sandcastle worms have adapted to life in the sifting or continuous moving sea of mud by anchoring the sediment together to make their tubes that are really very have a lot of integrity. So they really stick together, and they crunch when you walk over them because they're really well held together. And they're not highly abundant in the Minas Basin, but when you find them, they form really extensive beds, and they're very important in stabilizing the sediment. Another species or group of species that you might be surprised to find out again in the sea of mud are sponges, and I optimistically refer to this as a sponge garden. If you've ever seen an actual sponge garden in the deep sea or in tropical areas, you're thinking that's not a sponge garden, and you're right, it's really not. But hundreds of meters of sponges going along the very low water line in some of these areas. Polymastia, for example, that's these little pointy ones, and they go all the way along this particular low water line. You have to go out on a good low tide, but when you do that, there's some really surprising species like sponges that you wouldn't think would do well in an environment with such a lot of suspended sediment, because they could be so easily smothered out by that sediment. But there's parts of the basin where they're actually doing really well. So some other just fun examples of biodiversity. This little example up here, snail fur is the common name. It's a hermit crab that lives in shells, snail shells, and then it can be colonized by a species of hydrozoan called Hydractinia that only lives on shells inhabited by a specific species of hermit crab. And to make this more about polychaetes, there's a species of polychaete that it will only live in the Hydractinia on a particular species of hermit crab. So we have these highly specific commensal relationships. Mud pittocks, which you see in the upper right here, they, as larvae, settle out onto sandstone, and using acids and physical abrasion, burrow a hole where they will spend the rest of their life inside that sandstone. And by doing so, they don't just provide a home for themselves, but they actually provide a home for at least 9 other phyla of animals. So they make these really specialized, very patchy little microhabitats, if you like, that can support quite a diversity of life. This is a moon snail, and no, it's not living up to its name. This is its foot. It is not mooning the audience, but it's in the process of having a nice little tasty breakfast. And over here we have one of my personal favorites. This is a species I did my honors research on many decades ago. A sea slug that eats algae, takes up the chloroplasts into their gut cells, and then can photosynthesize or make their own food from capturing the energy of the sun. And their gut branches through their whole body. So everywhere, here's its head, and everywhere you see green is where they have these chloroplasts. And it's called kleptoplasty, stealing chloroplasts from another species. And that's what they do to make their food. And there's some interesting evidence that they've actually stolen genes from their algal prey as well. Chloroplasts, you may know, have quite a limited genome, and they rely on the nuclear genome to get most of their proteins. So in the algal host where the chloroplasts are supposed to live, it's all good, but the sea slugs don't have those same genes. And there's some evidence for horizontal gene transfer from the alga to the sea slug so that it can support the physiology and growth of the chloroplasts. But again, most of the species that are out there are polychaete worms, and there's a large diversity of them. Okay, so that just gives you a little bit of a snapshot into some of the invertebrate biodiversity. And I wish I could just do the whole talk on some of the really cool examples that are out there, but I do need to talk a little bit about my research, I think. So biodiversity in a sea of mud. This backdrop is a drone photograph from Evangeline Beach, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a great spot for migratory seabirds, and it's also near Sterling's, which has some of the best pie in the valley, I'll just say, if you're ever down that way. But this is sort of the initial impression of the Minas Basin as these vast expanses of mud. And the mud is suspended and moving. And a few years ago, 4 years ago, we became very interested in what would happen to this moving sea of mud in the advent of tidal power. So if tidal turbines were established in the channel coming into the Minas Basin, they would remove energy, which is of course what we would want from them. But as they would remove energy, the modeling by others suggests that that would decrease the amount of suspended sediment because there's less energy to keep the sediment up in the water, and change the way the sediment flows through the basin. And so the potential for energy extraction would potentially cause the amount of suspended sediment to decrease. So what we were interested in was how that would affect biodiversity. Most coastal ecosystems are a lot cleaner. Minas Basin's a big moving sea of mud. But the animals that are there are presumably adapted for that. So how would a decrease in suspended sediment change the diversity? So Sally, if you could call up the first poll, we're just going to do a little poll of the audience and see what you guys think before we actually get to the data. So how might a decrease in sediment suspended in the water column affect the marine invertebrates? And so biodiversity could increase, or biodiversity would decrease, biodiversity would remain unchanged. Oh, even split. Oh, no longer an even split. Oh, this is exciting. Oh, we're back to an even split between increase and decrease. Oh, more people think it would increase. Uh-oh, even split between increase and decrease. Biodiversity would remain unchanged. It's not getting a lot of votes, but it does have a small but steady degree of support. So anybody else want to vote? We've got 78%, 80% of the votes in. Last chance to vote, last chance to vote. Any more votes? Going once? Going twice? Excellent. So that was exciting. So biodiversity would increase or biodiversity would decrease was pretty much a even race there for a little while, but then there's a little bit of a nudge for biodiversity would increase as the sediment went